Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us today for the webinar. Today, I'm going to be your host. My name is Dmitry Bilash. I'm Chief Business Development Officer at Osavul. And today we have three amazing guests with us. So let me start with a quick presentation about today's event. Right after that, I will pass a word to our wonderful guests who will answer the questions and who will help us to dive into the details of the topic of today. So today we're discussing a new era of information threats right now. We're trying to navigate together with Rosemary, Amanda, and Greg regarding the PR and communication issues that are out there and what kind of strategies professionals should build to protect against new type of threats like disinformation, information manipulations, and information interference. Right now, this kind of issues are growing and are growing rapidly all over the world. Just recently, we saw elections in Europe, in Romania, that were actually cancelled and rearranged due to the interference through the online media into the electoral process. So it's a pretty growing thing out there, and we are happy to dive into this topic together with you. This webinar is hosted by Osavul. At Osavul, we develop AI-powered solutions for information environment assessment, for combating all kind of threats that we are discussing right now. We work mostly with governments and with big companies to identify narratives, key opinions, and threats, as well as the ways to mitigate them. As a software company, we develop these new technologies and cooperate with wonderful professionals across corporate and governmental sector all over the world. If we talk about the agenda for today, so I'd like to highlight maybe key questions that we're going to answer. The first one, how the traditional reputation risks transformed into complex new type of threats? How the information threats faced by governments can migrate actually to the private sector, can move from traditional topics like elections or geopolitical risks to corporate risks. And how can PR and communication specialists mitigate these challenges? How they should work on these issues and cooperate with other colleagues all over different departments to handle them. As I mentioned today, I'm your host. My name is Dmitry Bilash, and I'm running engagement with partners as a Chief Business Development Officer at Osavul. And we have three wonderful guests today with us. So I would like to ask them to introduce themselves. The first is Amanda. Please, Amanda, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Hi, it's great to be part of the panel today. So I am Amanda Coleman. I run a crisis communication consultancy here in the UK. I spent 21 years in police communication, and I was the head of communications in Manchester, as it says there, when the terrorist attack happened in 2017. When I left the police in early 2020, decided obviously just to focus on crisis. I've written 3 books. One of which has just been published. So that's on crisis communication, issues management, and then the recent one on reputation management. So that's me. Work with all kinds of businesses, organisations, public and private sector, in the UK and overseas as well. So I'm looking forward to the conversation today.
Thank you, Amanda. Pleasure having you here today. Greg, please, the floor is yours. Go ahead.
I would say good afternoon, but everyone's on different time zones, so I'll just say good day, everybody. Yes, I am my title here at the University of Georgia is University Spokesperson and Senior Advisor for Crisis Communications. I have been in communications for more than 35 years, including more than a quarter century as a PR professional. Prior to working at the University of Georgia, I worked at Rutgers University in New Jersey. And I've been in higher ed communications for nearly 21 years. And then before that, I worked for the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey in Manhattan. Not to belabor the point, but my office was in the World Trade Center, and I was stupid enough to be at my office, at my desk when the terrorist attacks occurred. And as a result, was directly involved both in the evacuation and in the restoration of services, as well as the rebuilding of Lower Manhattan.
Thank you, Greg. Thank you for sharing this. And Rosemary, pleasure to having you here.
Thank you for having me. So my name is Rosemary Ostman. I am the founder and CEO of Rosecom. which is a strategic communications firm started in 2003. So we've been around for 21 years. In addition to managing crises, which we do a lot, we also focus on proactive communications. Of course, the best defense is a good offense. So we want to make sure that we're working with our clients to create goodwill and trust around their brand so that when they do face a crisis, we are able to protect their reputation. I will say that I have worked with a large number of clients over those years. I've actually been in the business for more than 30 years. We work now in the healthcare space, the education space. We do have some government clients and also nonprofit. So what I want to leave you with before we get into the questions is I'm a big believer in any crisis can be anticipated and you can prepare for just about any situation. In the 30 plus years I've been doing this, I've never not been able to anticipate a crisis or a tough question. So I want everyone to feel encouraged that, and this is the nature of the conversation that we're having today, that people will forgive you for just about anything that happens to your organization. It's all about how you deal with it, how you respond to it. So thank you for having me.
Thank you, Rosemary. Guys, dear audience, as you see here today, we have quite a diverse experience, like both from the corporate, government, people who handled really big global crises, and I couldn't find, a better option to ask all these questions today. So maybe the first question from which I will start is how traditional reputation risks transformed into complex information threats. And I want to address this question, Rosemary, to you because you also work a lot like on the corporate side and on the government side. So could you maybe give some kind of a description? How do you see in the last years, maybe especially last 3-5 years, the reputation risks transformed into something more dangerous and serious? And what is this more dangerous and serious stuff?
So before I talk about the recent past, I'm going to rewind to the 90s, if you will, to probably the first internet rumor campaign, at least the first that I can recall, which was a campaign against Tommy Hilfiger. So for anyone who doesn't remember, there was a chain email, because this was all before social media. There was a chain email going around saying that Tommy Hilfiger was a racist and that he had gone onto the Oprah Winfrey Show to say that if he had known that Black people, Chinese people, and Jewish people would be wearing his clothes, he wouldn't have made them so nice. He never went on the Oprah Winfrey Show. He never met Oprah Winfrey, but this internet rumor took on a life of its own. And because it was before social media, the Tommy Hilfiger brand did not have the direct channels to address the rumor. They couldn't go out on social media and defend themselves. He is still addressing this rumor, and it was the late 90s. He gave an interview to The Guardian last year about how he continues to manage this situation. So, internet rumors and threats, information threats aren't new. For me, what is new, I'm less concerned about the technology because I actually think we have more tools now to communicate on behalf of our organizations, to monitor and to respond to threats. To me, the biggest threat over the last few years is the idea that we can't all agree on what is fact and what is fiction. I'm not willing to say that we are in a post-truth world. I'm not willing to give in to that yet. But I think that there's so much misinformation, so much disinformation, and so much disagreement as to what is true and what is not true. And I think for me, that complicates the situation and presents a bigger threat to institutions.
Thank you. I fully agree with you that right now the line between opinion, facts, and misinformation is quite thin. And it kind of erases the public trust. And Amanda, I wanted to ask you about in this regards, because for police, considering your experience, public trust is the key. Without that, this institution is not capable to conducting all their activities, right? So how to handle the situation where this line is thin and it's really kind of erasing the trust between institutions and citizens. How did you handle this when you was in charge?
Yeah, and I'm feel a lot about what Rosemary was saying, and all those other bit about you can kind of preempt anything, and about proactive nature of it. I think some of the element is really understanding how tenuous and how delicate trust is. I think we've taken it for granted, certainly in lots of kind of emergency response. Well, we are the police, the fire, whoever, so we command this kind of trust in what we do. When there's been a whole series in the UK of events over the last few years, last 3 years, that have really damaged public trust to the point where in August this year there were riots, and there's just a report came out today that was saying they should have been anticipated because everybody could see the tension was rising. And I think there's an element around really recognizing what is actually happening and also valuing the what you say and being really clear about what you do know and what is the truth. One of the things that often gets talked about is a good lie, where people are working for the best intentions because they want to make things better and they want to help people. They want to kind of stop about things getting worse. And then they will manipulate in different ways and not quite give the full picture. But it just comes back as a problem in the future. And I think this is one of the real challenges is, for me, and it always has been, and it was something that became quite difficult to deal with in my past, was the honesty that you've got to have all the way through things is really critical, because it takes a long time to gain trust and seconds to lose it. It's probably the last 5 years has got a lot worse. And again, I don't think it necessarily, as Rosemary was saying, it's anything to do with technology. I think it's more to do with the fact we went through the global pandemic and the impact that had, the way some of that got responded to, and the kind of legacy elements that came from that. So I think there's a huge amount of challenge around polarization, around how people use facts for good and ill. And I think, I'm not sure I'm going to say post-truth, I'm not going to go into that either, but I think we've got to get better at recognizing and understanding the misinformation, disinformation, malinformation, and also how we as communication professionals manage information. And we all aim to work to the highest kind of ethical standards, but actually in public inquiries and various other reports that have come out over the last couple of years, it's clear that isn't always the case. So I think there's a lot kind of tied up in that.
Yeah. May I ask one additional question, because our video might be interesting for maybe younger professionals who are just studying, working in police or in the government, and they actually feel this problem, right? Like, you are communicating something, there is a lack of trust, and you don't know what to do with this. So if you would, have a cup of coffee with this person, can you give maybe, one particular action that this person should come and do tomorrow on their working desk to kind of solve and make it a bit better? What kind of practical step you would suggest in this kind of environment to take to make this trust stronger?
I can't give one magic wand kind of moment that's going to sort everything out, but I think it is about recognizing the importance of your reputation and how you respond to it in a way that isn't about let's try and hide things to make us look better, but is about let's really deal with this and let's be open and let's aim to be as open and honest and transparent as we can be. So I think it's about really looking at what your values are about communication in good times and also in a crisis.
So the honesty and pushing to the openness, right, and transparency, this could be a solution. Sounds easy, much harder to do, but it makes total sense, right?
Yeah.
So I would like to maybe switch to the second question we have, and move a bit from the government, which we discussed quite a lot right now, to the private sector. And Greg, I want to address this question to you, because in academia you see more that each specific professional on their specific place. So do you see that the same issues that was previously faced by the government are moving to the private sector or not? And if yes, how they're changing?
Sure. First, I would say that there's some really easy examples to point to of government threats that have now migrated into the private sector. Actually, Rosemary's point about Tommy Hilfiger is a good example of how the private sector has been affected for a long time. The first two that came to mind when I was looking at this question were data breaches, which had been initially part of government issues. You had full databases that had, in the United States, people's social security numbers, other information that would be breached and shared malevolently. And now we are seeing that more and more in the private sector. We've seen it with Experian. We've seen it with other companies. The other thing is service interruptions. And there are information threats that can help disrupt services, both provided by public sector agencies as well as by the private sector. We've seen efforts to disable information passageways, to stop transportation services, to stop other kinds of services that are provided by government. But then also, when you're talking about dealing with customers and clientele, when those services are interrupted by whatever forces might be at work. Dimitri, can I go back to one other point I wanted to build on, something that Rosemary and Amanda said? Yeah, thank you. There were actually 2 points here that I wanted to make, if that's okay. One had to do with Rosemary's point about forgiveness, and the other about, actually the point that they both made about truth. One is in terms of how to anticipate what might go wrong. I heard a great presentation this past summer in Los Angeles with a gentleman named Jaime Longoria, who works for the Disinfo Defense League in Brooklyn. And one of the things he talks about is, and it's more in the realm of AI generated disinformation, but he said it's more valuable to tell a lie that's linked to a kernel of truth. And by that, he means what we can do as professional crisis communicators is assess what are the kernels of truth about our organizations that could be exploited for malicious purposes. And I'm going to point to an Ossoval analysis that I read a few days ago about disinformation in Ukraine related to social media in the month of August about corruption, and how, as part of that, your organization identified that more than 40% of the posts that have been made about corruption in Ukraine and anti-corruption efforts were completely false. So they can be discounted, but unfortunately that means that more than 50% might have some kernel of truth to them, and that just makes it that much harder to debunk, which is why I think it's important for people to anticipate. Now, to the forgiveness point, again, I heard from a gentleman named Patrick Jeffson, who used to be the chief of staff to Princess Diana. And one of the things he talks about when he presents is to maximize your forgivability before you need it. And he calls it that quality which gives you the benefit of the doubt on your worst day. And part of what he's saying is, build your goodwill, build your store credit, build all the capital you might need, because that way people will be, to Rosemary's point, more willing to forgive you. But it is a deliberate effort that has to go on before the crisis occurs. And that's some of the advice that I give to people I work with on a regular basis.
Thank you, Greg. Thank you. Yeah, indeed, we see that using our AI when we process a lot of data at scale of countries and regions, we see that the most effective way to build your narrative for attack is to build it on truth or partial truth. It's much easier than try to invent something, right? And it's much faster and typically much more effective. And it makes, the situations more complex, because any society, any company has some issues, has some flaws, has some mistakes. And what adversaries need to do, they just need to amplify this and try to, put some opinion on this. Right now, with all the generative AI capabilities, it's much, much easier than before. So, yeah, I fully agree with you on that.
Yeah,
Amanda,
can I just jump in?
Sure.
What Greg was saying, because I think there's been a trend that I've noticed in certain areas, and then I've commented. There's a few journalists that have been saying similar on social media on the last couple of days, of organisations going quiet and saying we're not going to say anything about whatever the issue is, and thinking that that's an appropriate kind of response. And I think you've got to own your space, as Greg was kind of saying. And for me, that's like completely contrary, because the minute you do that, we're not going to, you just kind of open the floodgates to everybody else owning that space as well. So I think it's an interesting one to kind of look at how that's developing, because years ago, I don't think we used to see it in the same way, whereas now there seems to be a big trend of, journalists getting that we're not going to talk about X or Y.
And if I could just build on that point, I agree with you wholeheartedly, Amanda. It reminds me of my days before I was in PR. I was a political journalist. And one of the rules I knew in politics was if you don't define yourself, your enemies will do it for you. And I think it's a really important point for people to understand that they need to own that space and focus not only on what's happening, but the steps that they're taking. I'm a big believer in, emphasizing the actions that an organization can take to address issues, as opposed to simply just issuing some kind of value statement right at the beginning and saying, this is who we are. I think people are mostly interested in what are you doing to fix a problem. And I think that that's, getting into the zone as early as possible with productive, positive action is one of the best ways you can help mitigate the risk of a situation like this.
Greg, Amanda, thank you so much for jumping in on that, and please feel free to do so. Like it's all welcome. We have a very open conversation. I'd like to add a bit of kind of corporate flavor to this discussion. Rosemary, I wanted to ask you about the current changes in the threat landscape with your clients, especially the healthcare industry, after obviously COVID, when everybody said that, information threats took so many lives just because people was not aware what to do and whom to trust. What do you see now in the corporate world? Maybe you can give us some examples of threats that you recently see. What is out there? Is it like becoming worse? Is it becoming better? And how does it affect customers? Because all of us are customers, right? Every day.
So actually, my answer to your question ties to the question that is up on the presentation, because I think we need to consider how blurry the lines are between the different aspects of society and how they influence one another. And something that we saw over the last 4 years under the Biden administration, and I know I'm speaking about the US, and this is a global panel and a global audience, but what we saw under the Biden administration was the political winds shifted in a way that corporations felt that they needed to be more vocal on certain societal issues than they had been previously. And that was a lot of the counsel that we were giving is, what issues do we need to address? Are there issues that we don't want to address? How vocal are we going to be? And a lot of that came from the millennial generation, the employees demanding to know that their employer cared about the same issues that they cared about. So it became an issue with current employees and prospective employees. And let's face it, ESG, the investment community. So it was really interesting to see how companies navigated that. And there were a lot of conversations that I had with my C-level executives that I would say felt more like therapy sessions than communications counsel, because it was very uncomfortable. You can no longer keep those lines between different audiences. That is over. Game over on that. We have to acknowledge that the lines are now forever blurred. But I think what's interesting now is we're seeing the pendulum swing with the most recent election results. And I think we're going to see businesses feel like they can go back to not addressing some of these issues. And it was already starting to happen before the election happened. We were already starting to see a pullback on addressing some of the societal issues, whether it was something related to DEI or anything else. So I think I find that to be personally very interesting. And I think companies, to Greg's point, need to be careful that if you go quiet and you stop addressing these issues because the political climate suggests that it's okay to do that, that could eventually come back to hurt you. Because if you're quiet, you're not vocal, you're not building up that goodwill, people don't understand your values. And when you do face a crisis, you will not have that capital in the bank, so to speak. So that's what I think is happening, what has happened over the last couple of years and what we're going to see over the next 4 years. And I'll just close by saying, I think that all of those shifts present a tremendous opportunity for the business community to step up and to be voices of authority in this climate. I think there is a greater appetite for what are the leading business voices saying on some of these issues. And I just hope that as communicators, we can help our clients and the organizations that we're working with think about what their voice can be in that larger conversation, and that we remember to use everything we talked about earlier as far as our values and our ethics as we guide them, because I think the influence of the business community will be greater than perhaps it has been.
Yeah. And I think it's a good bridge for our third question. And I want to start the discussion with Greg, with your point. So we clearly see that right now there are some changes right now, right, in the US, but I think it's happening, in quite a lot of places at the same time. We see this in the US, in Europe. Amanda, would be curious to hear your feedback after Greg regarding the UK on that. But obviously, if you have one trend, then it can change to another one. So first of all, Greg, do you agree with that? And second, how should companies, in your perspective, navigate with that? Should they create this bank of their identity and be vocal about everything, so they will be ready to respond and mitigate the crisis, or they maybe just focus less on communication issues as they communicated before, and maybe be more focused on the corporate earnings and so on. So what's your perspective on that?
Well, I agree with Rosemary's point about it. I will answer this with a cute line that I've used for years when I get asked a dilemma question, which is, I used to have an editor when I was a newspaper reporter who said the answer to every adult question is "it depends," and I think that part of where we need to look at this is to evaluate when a corporation, when a private sector entity wants to express an opinion about something or its values about something, then the question is, are they going to be able to stick by it? I've been doing a lot of work the last couple of years on what I call the values trap, which is this idea that when organizations want to talk about, public and private sector, about how a certain situation reflects positively or negatively on their values, I think they need to be very specific about what those values are. And I'm going to use an example that I heard from a friend who works for another organization. I'm not going to name the organization, but this was an organization that decided they were going to go out and they're in retail, and they wanted to value their support for the LGBTQ community. And so they came out, they had very large displays. They were very vocal about their support for the community. And then they got a lot of pushback from their customers. And so they almost immediately took it back, pushed it to the back ends of their stores. And when this person was talking about some of the issues they were facing, and I said, well, you do value this community, but you also have to value your profit margin, and you have to value what your stockholders want and things like that. And that's why I think it's very important for organizations to be very thoughtful when they're going to go into that sector, and at the same time have to understand that if they are going to cite values, they need to stick by them. Because one of the things we have seen, and I think in the United States, especially with higher education and the ongoing debate on campuses about the war in the Middle East, is that people will say, well, I value this, but then something else might happen that might look like it's contradicting that. I think the public tends to view and perceive values to be moral absolutes. And when organizations have to try to include some nuance, or trying to kind of convey certain other values that they share in addition to that value, sometimes, if it's not done very carefully, can come across as inauthentic, even hypocritical. And we have found, particularly in the higher ed sphere, this is one of the reasons that we've had some real serious challenges, not where I work, fortunately, but at other institutions with colleagues that I have, where they've had to maneuver their way through this minefield. So I do think it's important to state values and positions, but I think people need to be very careful and thoughtful about which positions they're going to stake out, and then make sure whatever positions they stake out, that they stick by them.
Yeah. So I think this is a very interesting topic, and I want to make it even a bit more sharper in our discussion. And Amanda, I have a question to you following that. So essentially here, we have a kind of an idea that during last maybe 5-10 years, the trend was that the brands, the institutions, because they're also brands to some extent, right? They need to be vocal about what they believe in and amplify this as much as they can. because this was kind of the main trend. Right now, it might be changing, right? And it's not becoming that mandatory. So what do you think, like, if from your perspective, you can cover both governmental one and corporate one, what should be done? Like, what would you do for your client? Would you still, maintain your open position to everything and reacting to all societal issues, or maybe you just will be less focused on that and drop some of them? What's your perspective? What's your suggestion on that?
Yeah, there's a couple of different elements for me. The first is what matters to you as a business, as a corporation, as an entity. And if it's something that relates directly to what you are about or what you profess to be about and your values, as Greg said, then you can't sit on the fence, because we are in this polarized, it's this or that, and it's right or wrong, you're there or you're over there. So I think if it's going to be something fundamentally that links to you, then, you can't sit on the fence. But then there's also this piece of what other people may require from you, which I don't think we're very good at in recognizing. And that goes back to really listening to what people feel, not just what they kind of say, how they feel about that business or organization. And really understanding that. And one of the things when I've been doing the research for the latest book was the challenge that we've got in really understanding where we are with reputation amongst key groups and individuals potentially that are influential at any point in time for any business, because I don't think we invest time in really understanding that. And without it, how do we actually really evaluate, understand, if something happens, how can we assess the impact if we don't know what it was like before that happened? So I think there's a whole piece around really listening and understanding, which should inform those decisions on where you are and aren't gonna get involved. It's a bit like with CSR and ESG and all those things. If you're getting involved in things that are not relevant, then it'll get called out, exactly as Greg was saying. It's not authentic, it's not genuine, it's not something that really should be there. But if it is, and you're trying to avoid it, people will be asking questions. And then you just appear really defensive and on the back foot and not really kind of proactively managing situations. So a bit like with Greg, it depends, which I'm going to use now, I think, with other things. I think you've got to have a real look at what matters to us, who is important to us, what do they think about us, and really having all that kind of information. And I'm, in the world we live in and the ability to use data and insights and various other things, we should be better at it, perhaps, than we are.
Yeah, and I think maybe we'll add one thing to that, because you mentioned a very important topic to measure and understand what your audience actually think, and it's really hard to do nowadays, because even if you want to do a polling, there is a lot of fraud, and people not genuine what they think, and it's quite expensive and it's long. We also see this with our partners and customers. That's why we, for example, run the opinion mining researches using AI when we collect the data from the open source. Like, it could be, especially for government, it could be millions of comments, and we try to apply AI to actually make sense of what is out there and what are the key opinions inside it, which can really help in our projects, for example, to guide the communications and understand, okay, so this is something people believe in your values, and this is something they just ignore, and you can be effective in what you invest your efforts in. Guys, thank you for the discussion on our questions here. And I actually have a few questions from our audience, and maybe I want to address them, because people have a demand. They need to get answers to their questions. The first one that I have: when running campaigns to protect governments and businesses from misinformation, what are the key success metrics to measure their effectiveness? Really good question, better than all my three in the list. Rosemary, may I address this question to you? It's really, really interesting how to measure, and can you give us particular metrics? How would you measure effectiveness of your company when you do any campaign of, countering the issue?
I think a lot of it will depend on the organization and their objectives, who it is that they're communicating with, what happened. I'll give an example of a client of ours that is a major education organization serving K-12, thousands of employees. They had a situation with their business in one particular geography in the United States where misconduct on the part of a handful of employees turned into a massive reputational crisis. It was actually why they hired us. We've been working with them for about 8 years now, and it's a much more proactive campaign. But at the moment, it was more reactive. And they were facing a situation where anyone in their target audiences that looked into the name of the school would go do a Google search, and the media coverage around the misconduct claims would be the first thing that would come up. And they contacted us and said, you've got to help us. We've got to get past this because we're tired of answering questions about this. And as it turned out, with that situation, there had been 6 independent investigations of the misconduct, and all of the investigations found no wrongdoing on the part of the school. It was a difficult situation, but they handled it appropriately. But that side of the story had never been told. So we started a campaign where we went to all of the journalists who had written about the charges and made sure that they completed their stories, that they put an update on each of their stories. So in the event that they turned up in search results, people would see a more complete story about the reality of what happened. We also then worked with them to tell positive stories because these are schools that are dealing with children with disabilities. And the work that they do is incredible. Yes, difficult things happened, but the vast majority of what they do is super positive, but they weren't telling that story. So we started to identify educators, students who we could go out and tell human interest stories that would change the search results when someone went to look into that school, to decide if the school system should get an additional contract, to decide if they should send their child to that school. We wanted all of those audiences to see a more truthful, but a more complete picture of that school. And so for that particular campaign, those were the success metrics. Can we shift the narrative so that there's positive coverage out there? And can we get the people who have written about the crisis to finish the story for us so that when people are out there searching for information, they don't see only the negative part of the story? So it's hard for me to broad brush say what the metrics should be because it really depends on the specific situation that you're dealing with and what you need to achieve to get past the problem that you're facing.
Yeah, people really like use cases. That's why I want to ask for more. Amanda or Greg, maybe you have any use cases in your mind that you saw was, in your work or from your colleagues, and what metrics did you use to determine whether this was a successful case or not?
Yeah, and I think for me, if I look at a number of things I dealt with in policing, we had obviously the arena. We also had some of those cases, like Rosemary said, where officers had behaved badly, whether that was accurate or not, and the kind of impact of it. But I suppose it goes back to, for me, how do you know how to measure it? You've got to really understand what is it you want to achieve. What is the outcome that you want to get to, and what's the realistic outcome that you want to get to? Sometimes we try and go, well, I'm going to, do something which you clearly are not going to be able to do because it's too kind of, well, I'm going to say not in a short term, particularly anyway. So I think there's an element of what do you want to achieve? We had a situation where, in terms of misinformation, there was an urban myth that developed and became a big media story around a canal pusher, a serial killer stalking the canals of Manchester, which there's canals in the city centre. And it became front page national news on one of the newspapers. And there was nothing in it. It was been concocted from a freedom of information request and misusing the information. So in terms of how do we approach it, we knew that this was going to be one of the biggest challenges to tackle because urban myths develop very, very kind of and become entrenched really quickly. So the way we do, there was no point in trying to do media releases, really speaking to the media about it, because they were part of the problem. They were stoking the misinformation. This goes back to the early days of social media. So thankfully it was only a little bit of a problem, not a big problem as it would be today. And in the end, because it became to the point that there was a documentary going to be produced, we ended up having to almost fight fire with fire and produce a mini documentary ourselves that tried to put everything in detail, because we knew the channel wise that was going to be one of the only ways we could manage it, to do it ourselves, to do it in the right way. To do something like that, though, you've got to have that trust level. Are people going to trust what we put out? So, what position are you starting from in managing that situation? So I think measuring kind of where we got to was it still exists. If you talk about a canal pusher to people, some people in and around Manchester will still be aware of that we're never going to be able to kind of eradicate it. But is it on the top of people's minds, and is it something now that is widely talked about? Then no. And I think that's the thing. It's like, where do you want to get to, and what's the realistic time frame to actually get you there? Businesses always want to move to solution really quickly. And I'm sure Rosemary and Greg have had this in the past, where you can see it's recovery. It's a long term. It's going to take a while. This is a big, damage. It's going to have a lot of impact. So I think there's a bit about how far can we get at what time, frame are we talking about, and being really realistic. But like I say, for us, the measurement was it's not being talked about in the same way as it was, and using different channels. And I think that's the other thing that we really have to push, and I try and push with clients now, is you can't rely on the traditional channels that we used to use to try and address some of the issues that we're facing now, particularly around misinformation and some of the kind of challenges of that.
Yeah.
Add something on to what Amanda said quickly.
Yeah. Please go ahead, Rosemary. Yeah.
I think this is a really important point about the longevity of a crisis. Just when you think that you've gotten past it, it can come back up and rear its ugly head. We see this a lot with crises. Sometimes if another organization has a similar crisis, the media will bring yours up again to say, oh yeah, and this also happened to X. Especially if there are a few and it's like a trend, it can go on for months and sometimes even years. In the situation with the education company that I talk about, what we were doing started in 2017. That's when we were starting to try to balance that story. In 2019, an investigative reporter doing a story for USA Today decided to bring the story back up because it fit a national narrative that she wanted to tell. Even though we felt like we had done everything that we needed to do to show that there was no wrongdoing, she brought it back up. Her investigation with us literally lasted for 2 years before her story published. We worked with her hand in hand for 2 years to try to get fair coverage of what had happened. So again, we thought we were past it. She decided to bring it back up. And we were as collaborative and as transparent, but also tough with her to say, if you are truly going to bring up this old story and to try to present it as new, here are the things that we are going to ask you to do to tell a fair story. And I won't go into more detail because we have limited time, but I wanted to just add on to Amanda's point that you really do need to track these crises over time and think about what might bring them back up. If you see a similar story in the national news, if you see a trend emerging, I had a client that had a shooting on site. Anytime we announced just about anything from this company, they would bring that shooting story up again, even if the story had nothing to do with the shooting. So unfortunately, these things have a life for years and years.
I agree wholeheartedly, Rosemary and Amanda, with what you just said. And I'm going to add, since, Dimitri, you were looking for examples. more than a decade ago. I'm not going to go back to the 90s. I'll go back to the early teens. We had when I was at Rutgers University, we had a very public student suicide that generated national media coverage because he had just come out as gay and he had been bullied by his roommate who ended up getting prosecuted. And it became and it was right at the beginning of the academic year. And it became this basically hung over the university for a very long time. And again, I agree with everything that the two of you said about how you have to do this. I think some of the points I would make are you do need to keep your eye on the long game. You always have to think that you're going to have to try to get your organization back to normal, even if it's a new normal, even if it's a normal that incorporates the understanding, to your point, Rosemary, that things might crop back up. Another thing I've been telling the people I work with lately is, setting the realistic expectations of how much you're going to get out of this. I'm sure the two of you have dealt with circumstances where someone will get really angry because you'll have a story that's everything you want, except there's 2 paragraphs that they hate, and they just obsess over that. And I'm trying to get the sense that, 80% of a win is still a win, and we need to think realistically about that. When it comes to the issue with the suicide, again, this was a very public situation. We partnered with the student's family very closely. I was in almost all of the meetings. This was not a media relations issue. This was just how we were responding as an institution to set up a foundation to stop, to address the issue of student bullying. And it eventually led to CNN, Anderson Cooper, coming to our campus a year after the suicide to do this international program, Bullying It Stops Here, which actually ended up winning a national Emmy Award. And the whole point behind it was, again, I get back to the point of what actions are being taken to address these issues. And after we had been, in the news for this terrible, terrible tragedy, we were in the news again and continued to be in the news for the steps, the actions that we'd taken to move forward from this and to try to create a better world, and that would, of course, not bring this poor, unfortunate student back, but at the very least, his parents could work with other people to try to help other students from being bullied. I'm going to use one line that I've been using a lot lately. We talked about values before. I love to say to the people I consult, I think you want to think about your verbs at least as much as your values. Think about the actions you're taking. Think about the steps you're taking. Rosemary, you talked about this with the education group, having stories about good things that have happened, having stories about the studies that were done, the postmortems that were conducted. That's another way to push that narrative. I think even with non-traditional media, if you can have a strong action that says it's an old line from the newspaper industry, show, don't tell. If we're showing that we're taking things seriously, we don't have to go out there and say we're taking them seriously. We just show people, here's what we're doing. And that will go a long way toward convincing them.
I was just going to say, just to add what Greg was saying, I think there's a big challenge, certainly the getting in the UK, and if I'm going back to the kind of UK institutions and governments and policing, and you kind of see in other places, trying to communicate your way out of a situation you've behaved your way into. So you can't communicate out of the fact that you have got a problem as an organisation or as a business. And I think there's a bit of actually really understanding, have we got an issue here? So back in 2017 in the UK, there was a tower block that caught Grenfell that was on fire. And when you read what was in the public inquiry report that came out just a few months ago, there's a whole series of elements where people ignored, didn't look at, didn't address things that's ended up creating kind of what happened. So I think there's a big question of, you do need a bank of here's what we're doing and here's how we're doing it. But if it's not rooted, I think like Greg was saying, in the actual tangible things that are happening, if your behavior is not changing, if the way you address things isn't changing, then no amount of positive stories is going to really make a difference. Policing in the UK is going through a very difficult time at the minute, where they're trying to send lots of positive stories, but aren't actually addressing some of the concerns and issues that lie behind why there was riots in August, and various other things. So I think it's an important aspect to consider when we're looking at how do you deal with things and what long term looks like?
Thank you, Amanda, for adding this. And we have one more question from the audience, which is related to the data breaches. How can organizations, what can organizations do to rebuild trust after suffering a data breach? I think, if I'm not mistaken, Greg, you was talking about the data breaches as an issue, right? You're on mute, please.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, I thought I was on mute. I thought I took it off. Actually, when I was at Rutgers, I chaired a panel about protecting confidential information. It was in compliance with U.S. law about how institutions like universities had to have a system in place to deal with that. And fortunately, we did not have a serious data breach. We did have a few minor situations that we had to deal with. But again, I think I go back to the action point and building on what Amanda said. We could talk a lot about how, we don't take this lightly and we want to make sure that we have people's trust. But I think, again, the steps that you take, if you're going to create stronger systems, if you're going to create more hoops that people have to jump through so that they can't get to that information. I think and to Amanda's point about being transparent about that, I think the more we are forthcoming about what we're doing, about taking responsibility for actions that have happened, and then saying, here's what we are doing to fix it. At the very least, that will show your sincerity and your authenticity to your customers. And again, that's one of those situations where it takes a long time for people to regain that kind of trust, but you have to take the time and you have to keep taking those actions and you have to keep communicating about those actions for people to accept what you're doing is really serious.
Thank you, Greg, for adding this. I think that we are kind of finishing our conversation and timeline. So I would like to maybe give a last word to each of you to wrap it up and give some last tips and hints to our audience. So maybe we'll start from Amanda. Give us the final word.
Oh gosh, try and condense everything. I think the thing for me is to plan, prepare, exactly as Rosemary was saying, but also to be really realistic about where you can get at what point. And in all of it, recognize you might have to be a risk taker at a point when an organization wants to be very risk averse because of something happening, and be human in how you approach it.
Thank you. Rosemary, the floor is yours.
So I think that for me, just staying very mindful of the fact that information is flowing in a very different way than it has historically. Years ago, we would primarily be worried about the media covering a crisis and what that might do to our reputation. And for better or worse, people aren't paying attention to earned media in the same way that they used to. So really making sure that you are prepared to monitor all of the channels. One of the things that we're seeing with a lot of our clients is the early signs, the early signals that there's a problem are happening in private groups. So really understand where your audience is and make sure that you have an ear in those different channels so that you can anticipate the problems. Also think about the role of AI in how your story is being told. People are becoming more and more dependent on AI. AI is getting better and better at capturing information and becoming a resource for people to learn about situations. So understand what is feeding AI and what AI is saying about you, because that will drive a lot of what's happening if you're dealing with a crisis. And then finally, I think, always it's important to remember going through a crisis is brutal. It can feel like a massive drain on resources, especially for a profit-making entity that is trying to grow their business. They have other things that they would prefer to focus on. But if you keep in mind, as you're going through a crisis, that every crisis is a tremendous learning opportunity for your organization, not just in how you communicate, but in how you operate as a business. And I wrote down what Amanda said about you can't talk your way out of what exactly you said. If you behaved your way into it, you can't talk your way out of it. I say this a lot to my clients. I know this is painful right now, but you're going to emerge from this crisis a better organization. You needed to learn something from this. So I think if we can keep that in mind as we navigate our way through, it becomes less of a nuisance and more of an opportunity.
And Greg, please go ahead.
Sure. First, I agree, Amanda. That's the line of the webinar. So I think we should all take that one to heart. I had a coworker at Rutgers who then went on to Stanford and just retired. He used to say it slightly more bluntly, which was, no matter how hard you try, you can't spin stupid. And I've got that one up on my wall at work. The other point I was going to make, and this might seem a little more esoteric, but I would encourage the people who are part of this webinar, the people who have listened, the people to keep learning about how this profession works. I said this to the organizers when we first started putting this together, that there are two unfortunate truths about crisis communications. One is that it's a growth industry, and number two, that a lot of people aren't very good at it. I can't speak for myself. You can judge for yourself how I came across, but I can tell you, Rosemary and Amanda are both tremendous professionals who I want to stay in touch with and trade secrets with and trade information with about how we can do a better job of this. And I think we all need to work collaboratively across the world as this profession grows to ensure we are following the best practices as we define them to help our clients weather the storms that, quite frankly, will inevitably occur.
Thank you, Greg. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. So I think we have really a great conversation with a lot of valuable insights from professionals who really know how to handle the crisis, who went through the crisis, and who shared some trade secrets with us today, how to handle this. From our perspective, we are trying to build a technological bridge to the crisis communications, bring new technologies to handle them, to better understand your audience, to apply AI to process big data, and find smarter ways, more effective ways to respond to these threats. So we are happy, to join this crowd of wonderful professionals and supply new technologies to people like them to help handle the most complex situations that each of us must face. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you, our audience. This webinar is recorded, will be shared afterwards. So those of you who were not able to join for the whole event can then take a look on that later. Thank you for conversation today, and have a nice day. Bye, guys.